Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into a really pivotal, complex, and often pretty brutal period. We're talking transatlantic trade and mercantilism.
Yeah, it's a huge topic, shapes so much of the modern world.
Absolutely. And our mission here is to really dig into our sources, pull out the key insights for you. We want you to understand how this whole Atlantic economy thing got started.
Right, how it actually worked.
Exactly, like that triangular trade, what was that really about? And the societal changes it triggered across Europe, Africa, the Americas. It was massive.
Profound changes, yeah.
So let's dive in. First off, this Atlantic economy. Before we had the global system we know now, this started taking shape. What did that actually mean back then? What was moving back and forth?
Well, it's crucial to understand it wasn't just goods. I mean, yes, manufactured stuff from Europe, raw materials from the Americas. But the system also tragically included the forced movement of enslaved Africans and American Indians.
So people were part of the goods being exchanged.
Dehumanizingly, yes. European colonial powers were laser-focused on getting commodities, sugar, tobacco, timber, things highly valued in Europe, and they needed labor for that.
Which led to?
Which led directly to seeking new sources of labor, fueling the horrific growth of the transatlantic slave trade.
And you mentioned American Indians being caught up in this too. What was the effect on their communities as these trade routes expanded?
It was complex and often devastating. On one hand, yes, trade meant more European goods flowing into their communities. That did bring some cultural and economic changes, adaptations.
But there was a huge downside.
A catastrophic one. The biggest impact, honestly, was disease. Epidemic diseases brought by Europeans to which they had no immunity. We're talking about population collapses, sometimes 50, even up to 90% declines in some areas, incredibly rapidly.
90%. That's unimaginable. That must have completely destabilized their societies.
Absolutely. It shattered social structures, leadership, their ability to resist colonization. It created vulnerabilities that echoed for centuries. It wasn't just fewer people. It was a fundamental disruption.
Wow. Okay. And meanwhile, you had powers like Britain trying to knit this all together, right?
Right.
Trying to integrate their North American colonies into this imperial structure.
They were certainly trying, though, as our sources point out, enforcing these grand plans wasn't always smooth.
Right. The erratic enforcement bit.
Yeah.
Conflicts and distance made it messy in reality.
Exactly. Grand designs versus the complicated reality on the ground.
So within this larger Atlantic economy, there's this specific route that gets talked about a lot, the triangular trade. It sounds neat geographically, but what was actually happening on those three legs? What were the mechanics of it?
It really was named for the shape, you know? Merchant ships following a pretty consistent three-part journey, a cycle.
Okay.
And a pretty grim cycle at that. So a ship might start in, say, New England.
Okay.
Loaded up with rum, maybe other goods. They'd sail that to West Africa.
And trade the rum.
Trade the rum for enslaved African people. The demand for forced labor in the Americas, particularly for sugar plantations, was just exploding.
Right.
Then came the second leg. West Africa to the Americas, usually the British West Indies first. This was the infamous Middle Passage.
Infamous for good reason, I gather.
For horrific reasons. The conditions were incredibly brutal, inhumane, overcrowding, disease, violence, just unimaginable suffering packed onto those ships.
God.
Once they arrived in the West Indies, the enslaved people who survived the journey were traded, exchanged for sugarcane, mostly.
And then the third leg.
The third leg was back to New England. The ships carried the sugarcane, which was then processed often into rum.
And that restarts the whole cycle.
Exactly. Trading the sugarcane, getting rum, heading back to Africa. It was a systematic, relentless process designed for profit extraction built on human misery.
It really highlights the scale, the systematic nature of it all. Not just random ships, but a design network. And underpinning all this was a specific way of thinking about economics. Right? Yes, absolutely. Our sources call it mercantilism. This was the dominant idea at the time, even if other economic thoughts were maybe starting to bubble up. What was the core belief of mercantilism?
It really boils down to a fundamental assumption about wealth. Mercantilists believe there was only a finite amount of wealth in the entire world.
Like a fixed pie.
Exactly like a fixed pie. And that wealth was primarily measured in gold and silver. So if the pie is fixed, the goal for any nation is to get the biggest possible slice.
How did they try to do that?
The main goal was achieving a favorable balance of trade. You wanted to export more goods than you imported.
Because exporting brings in gold and silver, importing sends it out.
Precisely. You want more money flowing in than flowing out. It wasn't just about being rich. They saw this national wealth, this stockpile of gold and silver, as directly translating to national power.
Okay, that makes sense. Get the biggest slice to be the strongest nation.
How did colonies fit into that picture? Was it just about grabbing land? Colonies were absolutely central to the mercantilist strategy. They offered a sort of twofold benefit, you see.
Okay.
First, they provided access to raw materials that the mother country didn't have at home. Think timber from North America, sugar from the Caribbean, tobacco, things Europe wanted but couldn't produce easily.
Right, resources.
Yeah.
What was the second benefit?
Those same colonies then became captive markets for the mother country's manufactured goods.
Ah, so you sell your finished products back to the people providing the raw materials.
Exactly. It creates this closed loop. Raw materials flow in, manufactured goods flow out, and crucially, the profits, the gold and silver, ideally stay within your own imperial system rather than going to a rival nation.
And the British government was pretty active in trying to enforce this, weren't they? You mentioned trying to integrate the colonies, things like the Navigation Acts.
Yes, the Navigation Acts were prime examples of mercantilist policy in action. They were designed specifically to make sure that trade benefited England, maximized that flow of gold and silver into British hands.
What do they actually require?
Well, there were two really key provisions. First, they mandated that any trade with English colonies had to be carried on English ships, crewed mostly by Englishmen.
Keeping the shipping profits and control in-house.
Exactly, cutting out rivals like the Dutch. Second, certain valuable goods produced in the colonies, these were called enumerated goods, like sugar, tobacco, indigo, had to be shipped exclusively through English ports first, even if their final destination was elsewhere in Europe.
And I assume they got taxed at those English ports.
You bet they did. It generated revenue for the crown and allowed English merchants to act as middlemen, further concentrating the profits in Britain. These acts were really foundational to the whole imperial economic structure.
But probably not very popular in the colonies eventually, I'd guess.
That's putting it mildly. They became a major source of friction down the line, absolutely.
Okay, so we have this vast economic system, these trade routes, this driving philosophy. But what about the impact on society? Beyond the massive wealth for some and the horror for others, how did it change the social fabric, especially maybe in the Americas?
The societal transformations were really profound. All this trade generated enormous wealth, but it was concentrated. Merchants, big investors, plantation owners, the elite, they benefited massively.
Creating a new class of wealthy people.
Absolutely. You could argue it was the first real burst of modern capitalism in many ways. It also physically changed the landscape. America's seaports, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, exploded into major urban centers because they were the hubs for all this trade activity.
Makes sense. Goods, money, people all flowing through.
And all that wealth and the increased availability of goods flowing into those ports sparked something else. What historians call the consumer revolution, particularly in North America.
Consumer revolution. So people just started buying more stuff.
Essentially, yes, but it had deeper social implications. Affluent families, and even those aspiring to be affluent, began acquiring more goods than ever before. Imported textiles, furniture, ceramics, tea sets, things that weren't basic necessities.
And that changed how people saw themselves and each other.
It really did. This is one of the most intriguing shifts. Before this period, certainly in Europe and largely in the colonies too, your status in society was heavily tied to your family, your lineage, your pedigree.
Born into the right family, you had status.
Pretty much. But with the consumer revolution, status started to become much more linked to, well, financial success and demonstrating that success through a refined lifestyle. Your ability to buy and display these fashionable goods became a marker of respectability and standing.
So it wasn't just who you were, but what you could afford and how you presented yourself.
Exactly. Financial success and a certain kind of cultivated taste started to challenge or at least supplement inherited status. It was a fundamental shift in social values. Of course, we have to constantly remember the dark side too.
What you mentioned the diseases earlier, that was tied into this increased movement.
Absolutely. This vast network wasn't just moving goods and people. It was an incredibly effective conduit for epidemic diseases, which continued to devastate populations, particularly indigenous communities who had no prior exposure. That's a critical, tragic consequence of this interconnectedness.
So pulling it all together, this period saw the creation of a truly global, interconnected Atlantic world. It was fueled by mercantilism, built on these complex and often brutal trade networks like the triangular trade.
And it fundamentally reshaped societies everywhere it touched. Europe, Africa, the Americas, none were left unchanged. It created immense wealth for some, unimaginable suffering for millions, particularly enslaved Africans.
And laid the groundwork for economic systems and even social hierarchies that we're still dealing with today.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so that really covers the core of it. The Atlantic economy's rise, the mechanics of the triangular trade, the logic of mercantilism, and these huge societal shifts. It's incredible how an economic idea and a trade route could have such far-reaching, complex, and frankly devastating impacts.
It really is. And it makes you think, doesn't it? How much of our modern global economy, the inequalities we still see, the very way we think about national wealth or even personal status, how much of that still carries the echoes of this mercantilist colonial era?
That's a powerful thought to end on, the long shadow of this period.
It's definitely something worth reflecting on, how these historical structures continue to shape our present in ways we might not even fully realize. The past is rarely truly past.